All right, good morning, folks. Thank you so much for being here at 8:30, the night after the Build Social. So it's good to see some familiar faces from the booth this week as well. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about, unlocking developer agility through a well-governed environment. But we'll ground this in some of the services and products that we believe can help you achieve this goal today. And we'll also spend some time talking about how Microsoft actually manages our engineering platform across the largest tenants that are run on Azure today. So I want to start off by talking about a quick diagram, and we'll see if there's a show of hands on how many folks this resonates with. So let's say that your dev lead comes up to you and says, we have a new requirement that we need your application or your engineering platform to achieve within 1 month. The reality is, even though you may have a really solid understanding of what this means in terms of requirements, or what this means in terms of the next few development cycles, you might need to ultimately go through a review with security because you could be interacting with customer data. Security might say, okay, this looks good, but this is a bit of a new architecture type. We want you to go ultimately review this with our cloud architects. Based on that, the cloud architects could say, this is way too expensive. You need to go meet with our operations team. And from there, the 1 month project has actually been sucked into 3 weeks of meetings, documents, and reviews that at the end of the day, don't get you closer to that goal or release that you were hoping to target. So all of these functions are important, but what we want to focus on is how services in Azure governance can help you get from code to cloud at a faster pace. So I want to take a quick pulse for a show of hands. How many of you, work within an engineering platform in your organization? Okay, so a couple people. How many of you are managing, more subscriptions than you know what to do with? Okay, a couple of people. So you'll hopefully get something out of this session then as a result. But so when we've been talking to you folks, our customers, we've been investigating what platform engineering really means, both in terms of a mindset shift as well as the tools and services that you can use to build out your engineering platforms. And this has really been divided into sort of these 3 themes. The first being start right, so really equipping developers with self-service tools. We'll talk about some of the services today that we believe can help here, but this could also be a standard library with infrastructure as code templates, really things that you want your developers to be able to use in a repeatable fashion. The second one being stay right, or the governance story. So let's say that you have all of the right sign-offs, approvals, you know what to do. How do you make sure that there is ultimately lasting adherence to these standards through compliance? And the last one is get right. So I'm willing to bet that most of you here have a pretty sizable amount of resources already deployed in Azure that might not be 100% compliant against all of the standards that you ultimately want these resources to adhere to. And so how do you go back and make sure that resources that were already deployed or maybe originally outside of your engineering platform but newly brought in also can sort of get right and get compliant? So we'll be talking about some of the governance services today that we believe can actually help across all 3 of these pillars. The first being Azure Policy, which is really Azure's built-in configuration management platform. The second being Azure Resource Graph, which represents real-time states across all of your resources in Azure. It's really your built-in CMDB. The third being tags to, again, more easily partition your data to examine through Resource Graph, as well as management groups, which allow you to ensure that you're able to target various deployments as well as policy deployment in a way that's safe and gradual. And we'll be going into a lot more detail here too. But Kemley, is that and more supposed to be there? Was that supposed to be on the slide?
To find out.
Okay, so maybe a few more as well. Awesome. So let's talk Azure Policy. How many folks in the audience are already using Azure Policy today? Okay, great. So we've got a few experts, so we won't spend too much time on the overview, but I do also just want to talk specifically about how we think that Azure Policy can really help make platform engineering even easier within your organization. So Azure Policy allows you to apply policies at management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, at any level, even up to the root management group. This allows you to observe compliance over a period of time, which is super important, as you run larger campaigns to stay right. We also provide a wide suite of remediation capabilities, including remediation of existing resources at scale, so you can clean up, non-compliant resources that may have been deployed outside of your engineering platform, automatic remediation of resources at deployment time, and this can actually be further automated through functions or logic apps which can be triggered through Event Grid. And you can see here that policy, again, helps you start right through deploying those initial policies, helps you stay right through observing compliance, and get right through remediation. So we want to spend a couple of minutes also talking about why Azure Policy is uniquely positioned to help you reach these goals compared to services from other cloud providers. So Azure Policy today is ultimately built on top of the Azure Resource Manager, which represents our centralized control plane and actually creates a standard that all services in Azure comply with in terms of the way that you can interact with the life cycle of your resources. And so as a result, Azure Policy is able to evaluate every incoming request to create these resources and make sure that they are compliant against the standards that you expect ultimately your development teams to abide by. So this can be in a few different flavors. I'll talk about some of these enforcement modes briefly, but again, won't spend too much time here. So deploy if not exist, which allows you to deploy related resources. Let's say that for all of your virtual machines, you want to make sure the monitoring extension is deployed alongside that. This can be expressed through a deploy if not exist policy. Deny policies so that you can make sure that nobody goes and deploys the most expensive SKU of virtual machine at a moment's notice. And we've actually taken deny policy one step further through not only governing resource configuration, but extending it to govern resource actions. So for example, you can use a deny action policy to prevent accidental deletion of maybe a mission critical Cosmos DB that contains customer data that you really can't lose. Modify actually even takes this one step further, and as the request comes into Azure Policy and maybe contains a piece of configuration that you don't expect or don't want to allow, Azure Policy will actually transform the request in order to maintain compliance against that resource deployment. Okay, so we want to deep dive into some of the new stuff that we've been working on as well. You'll notice here that the two main buckets for where we're focusing our investments in Azure Policy really fall into safety of use as well as the power of the policy language in language and expression. So this past year, we went generally available with our support for built-in policy as well as initiative versioning, selectors and overrides, which allow you to more granularly deploy both your policy assignments as well as policy effects. On the language and expression side, we'll be deep diving into IP filtering, which allow you to, again, extend beyond just resource configuration into request context, as well as identity-based exemptions. I also want to take a quick pause here to see if folks are currently leveraging, machine configuration or AKS policy. Okay, a couple of you, so hopefully more by the end of the session too. But we've actually extended Azure Policy to go beyond just the footprint of your resources, in the Azure control plane, and have extended this to help you govern your virtual machine operating systems, as well as Kubernetes cluster components. So some exciting releases here as well, including support for MSI-based access to custom machine configuration policies, as well as support for image integrity and data replication support on AKS. Can we move to the next slide, maybe? Awesome. Thanks. So a couple of the releases we wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about are first IP filtering through Azure Policy. So as we mentioned, we are moving beyond configuration of the resource payload itself into what actions we expect to be taken on resources. So leveraging the deny action effect, you can now specify an allowed or disallowed IP range that you expect certain actions to be coming from. So this allows you to achieve certain scenarios, including, let's say that there are specific operations that you might only want to come, over a secure network, or you might want to enforce that, your employees are only able to interact with the Azure tenant that you operate in within, your specific geography. So this now allows you to specify either sort of that allowed or disallowed IP range where you expect specific actions to come from, and allows you to enforce that through deny action. Thanks, Emily. Awesome. So I want to talk a little bit more as well about identity-based exemptions. So the exemption resource today in Azure Policy allows you to exempt, based on individual resources or subscopes. And, this is super useful at the end of the day when you might have a, pretty restrictive control that you want to deploy at a really high scope, but there could be, an edge case or sort of a smaller scope that needs to be exempt. So we've listened to the feedback on exemptions today and have also introduced a new type of exemption which allows you to exempt based on user context. So SPN, MSI, or security group. And picture a scenario where you need to completely lock down your networks, but how can you tell your network admins that they're not able to go in and make necessary changes in sort of the right scenario? So we have an example of what this payload looks like today. And on the visual here, you can see that within the exemption, we've said that the allowed user who can deploy a VM from a limited SKU is under Chemly's user ID. So even though Chemly and I would have, submitted the exact same request, my request would have been blocked and hers would have been approved, which is why Chemly will be conducting our demos today. Thank you. Okay, awesome. So that's a little bit of what we've been focused on over the last year, but we wanted to really deep dive into how we are using these primitives across, ultimately Microsoft's largest Azure environment, which are the tenants that are owned and operated by our teams. So we'll spend some time talking about specifically, how you can safely deploy these guardrails over large-scale environments. So a lot of this work has been driven by SFI, or the Secure Future Initiative, which is really, we've talked about this publicly, it's a company-wide, multi-year initiative to improve the platform security of our products and services. It's a commitment that every team across Microsoft has made, and in terms of being able to have a secure by default story, we've taken an outsized dependency on Azure Policy to be able to cement the work that teams have done to get secure in order for them to stay secure. Imagine that a team has done all of this work in order to begin deploying secure infrastructure, but someone new joins the team that might not have had that historical context. You need to make sure that that progress is cemented through a policy that will prevent the deployment of non-compliant resources before they happen. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit how you can get started to do this, but when you're deploying at environments that are this large, this isn't really getting started. This is like level 1,000. But the first step is really organizing your environment in a way that makes it safe and seamless to deploy policy gradually. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like across our tenants. We won't go into too much detail here, but the best way to get started in terms of governing scopes that may not already have policy applied is actually through interacting with the over 2,500 built-in definitions that we have in policy today. The third thing is, if you're deploying policy across tenants and need to take advantage of the safe deployment primitives that we have, we really, really encourage you to try policy as code. And yes, love to hear it. And we really encourage you to try this out. And we've made it super easy, and we'll talk a little bit more about why through the structure of some of the primitives that we use in Azure today. And the fourth step here is really safe deployment. And we'll talk about why we feel like this is important and something that you should be paying attention to, and specifically talk a little bit about how we've addressed this within our own tenants today. Awesome. So we'll be really deep diving into how we recommend you to organize your environment, but I want to talk a little bit about what our management group hierarchy looks like within Microsoft. We separate both by business unit as well as environment type, and have subscriptions mapped to applications or services. This allows us to gradually deploy policy, ring by ring, so starting across our test to non-prod to production subscriptions, and then ultimately, moving across services and regionally through subscriptions from our lowest traffic to our highest traffic regions. So we talked about policy as code. A couple of fans in the audience. One of the reasons why policy as code is actually pretty seamless to integrate within your CI/CD pipelines is because today the primitives and the resources that policy provides are all standalone resources in the Azure Resource Manager, allowing them to have a full life cycle in terms of the way that they're deployed, in terms of how you can interact with selectors, in terms of how you can manage exemptions through integrating with either your engineering platforms or other tools that you may use. So policy as code is something that we've taken a huge dependency on within our tenants. And this is because we roll out super impactful policies across tenants at high scopes. So I want to walk you through sort of what our process looks like, and then we'll go through an end-to-end example here. So stage one for any policy rollout at any scope is really deploying that audit policy. The Azure Resource Graph gives you a great point-in-time reference of what the state of your environment is, how many storage accounts might be deployed in a configuration that you don't want. But it's important that you have that view of compliance over a period of time to understand the risks of deploying more impactful enforcement policy. So everyone wants to jump to stage 3. We want to get to central enforcement. Audit policy results can sometimes be scary, and ultimately you want to lock these down at a high scope to make sure that your developers are deploying compliant resources. But the reality is this can take a really long time, and there's always a trade-off between moving quickly and impacting service or application teams. So within Microsoft, we've actually shifted to a more decentralized approach through opt-in policy rollouts. So opt-in policy rollout allows us to deploy the policy in an enforcement effect with enforcement actually disabled to begin with. And so what this means is that your application teams are able to decide when it makes sense for them to opt into policy enforcement. At the end of the day, you're running an engineering platform. You don't have all of the signals that you inevitably need to be able to make an informed decision over when every team deploys, over what their health signals are, over what dependencies there might be, which make this specific change risky. And so we've shifted to an opt-in policy approach, which ultimately allows you to empower your developers to take more control over the security or durability of subscopes that they ultimately own. So the primitive that we have today to enforce opt-in policy is tags, but we'll be talking a little bit about how we're going to take this one step further and first-class policy opt-in through a new resource that you can expect to be landing soon. Awesome. So we talked about a few different concepts. I just want to go over a visual here to sort of show what this looks like end to end. So let's say that you have a policy that will limit outbound access of resources in your environment. You first want to make sure that you understand the state of your environment at a point in time, which is why it's super important to leverage ARG to understand the scope of the problem or the campaign that your team will be running. The second is creating and testing this audit policy to deploy. And even for audit policies, we do recommend taking this slowly and gradually rolling out across rings as well as regions. After you have those audit policy results, we recommend that you deploy the deny policy with enforcement mode as disabled in order to facilitate an opt-in campaign. And as teams continue to opt in, you want to monitor that percentage until it meets an expected threshold where you now feel comfortable to move that policy to central enforcement. At which point, you can then take a dependency on the exemptions that you know and love today, as well as the identity-based exemptions that we spoke about earlier that are coming soon. Okay, we've talked a lot about some of the things that are coming soon. We actually have a jam-packed roadmap here, so really excited to get some of these features in your hands. I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the features that we think you'll be interested in, and then we'll pass it over to Kemley to talk about some of the work on organizing resources. So the first thing is the policy enrollment resource. So we talked a lot about how we're shifting to an opt-in model for policy enforcement. But we need a way to safely deploy these opt-ins. We need a way to track this. Ultimately, you need a full resource lifecycle in order to create a first-class experience for opt-in policy rollout. And so we're releasing enrollment resources, which you can almost think about as the anti-exemption. We're also expanding the scope of policy to govern post-API requests. So this will be able to unlock really interesting scenarios, including governing resource moves, things like feature registrations or resource actions. Versioning for custom policies, really the second half to our built-in version management story here. And then the last one is actually super exciting, policy authoring Copilot capabilities to make it easier for you to translate your natural language requirements into policy definitions that you can then deploy safely through the process that we mentioned before. So happy to take any questions on the policy content or our roadmap at the end of the session. But maybe we can move to the next slide. But we want to talk a little bit more about how you can start right through our Azure Resource Graph, as well as how you can continue to stay right and better understand your environment through a well-organized Azure environment. So I'll pass it over to Kemley to talk about some of our innovations in that space.
Perfect. Thank you, Jody. So as Jody mentioned, I'll dive a little bit deeper into Azure Resource Graph and then touch on some new features coming out for organizing your resources at scale. So for those that might not be familiar, Azure Resource Graph is your real-time inventory of all of your Azure resources. It has a long list of resources supported, properties, and everything around the configuration of those resources. It also supports complex filtering and query on a language loosely based off of KQL for all your visibility needs. It also contains changes to your resources, which is really critical when trying to understand and detect unexpected behaviors on your resources. So you can see here, this is the change analysis within Azure Resource Graph that gives some information as to what are the resource types that were changing, what was the change type, who made the change, and other information as such. An also exciting thing that we had been talking about in past conferences is the integration of ARG with Copilot and the first-class integration with Power BI. This is now generally available for everyone to use within the Azure portal, and we'll be switching to a quick demo. Let me switch over here on how that happened. So let's say I get an email from my cloud admin, Jody, asking me to send a list of all of my subnets that are tied to my network interfaces.
By the end of the day, please.
And I'm like, where do I start, right? So I'm going to go to Copilot, to my trusty personal assistant, and type in the natural language prompt of, hey, Copilot, please help me out here, right? Let me get a list of all my subnets connected to my network interfaces. I submit that prompt into Copilot within the Azure portal. Give Copilot a little second to look into it, and it pops out an ARG query for me to run. I can click Run within the chat, and it'll pop up the top 5 results of that query. I'm going to save this query so I can use it a little later to share with Jody. But for now, I'm going to click on Azure Resource Graph, check out the query, and also explore the more detailed results. From there, I can then flip over into Power BI, load in that query. As I mentioned, if you click over to Azure and Azure Resource Graph, you can see it's a first-class experience and an easy paste of your query straight into Power BI. From there, the information will be loaded into Power BI, and you can do all the fun charts and stuff that are required. For this, it's a little plain. It's just a list for now, but you can imagine doing pie charts and any other complex visualizations. And then I can go and share that Power BI dashboard with Jody and complete my tasks for the day. Cool. So we talked a bit about policy. We talked a bit about Azure Resource Graph. Some other governance features that you might be familiar with is tags and management groups today. We talked about the importance of having a management group structure to be able to do things like policy at scale and being able to divide your dead, non-prod, and prod environments. Tags, we know, are also heavily leveraged in different governance scenarios, such as being able to know your applications or your cost centers or important information relating to these resources. But there's a new one. So as we started talking with customers and even within our own internal conversations, we realized that it could be quite complex for our developers to understand what's going on, right? You have people telling you do this, add this tag, make sure different things are going on, and then you're expected to manage your fleet of resources or your application or your service across all of these requirements with no true solution to be able to see everything in one state. And because of this, we often see people having to rely on a mixture of different products. So you have strict naming conventions, you require certain locations, tags, you're using a slew mixture of resource groups and subscriptions to kind of model these groups. Well, insert service groups. Service groups is a new first-class group to Azure. So similar to management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups that exist today, service groups is a new resource container that supports flexible aggregation information from across your whole tenant. Service groups is meant to be the generic group platform for many scenarios. This could be from understanding your application hierarchy to having your service hierarchy, to seeing a different fleet of information, to aggregate costs. Anything that might need that flexibility of bringing in different types of resources together to aggregate and get additional information on it. Now, what is a service group? A service group is a tenant-level resource that supports hierarchy, and it's flexible in nature. Here you can see an example of an existing environment. We have the standard management group, subscription, resource group tree, and a set of infrastructure underlying underneath it. Service groups is meant to work in parallel with these grouping structures. So don't worry, we're not overriding them, getting rid of them, they'll stick around. Service groups is just to work in parallel to give you a different view of that topology and give you more flexibility to see your infrastructure in different lenses. Service groups is also meant to have different personas and scenarios. It is least privileged by nature, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the coming slides, but it really is meant for other people to be able to take it over and understand, like, what is my application, what's going on in it. Some key things of what service groups is not. Service groups is not a deployment scope, meaning resources still have to be deployed within a resource group. And it does not support policy or RBAC inheritance. And we'll touch a little bit more why in the later as well. So, what is unique about service groups compared to the existing groups that exist today? First is hierarchy. It supports up to 10 levels of depth of hierarchy, really letting you get into the nitty-gritty of the information. So we know a lot of people today, for example, have 2, 3, 4 tags just to be able to detect where in the applications does this live in. Or, it's not just one service, but you have your service instances, your components of your services, and that hierarchy gives you that flexibility to get granular. Next is flexibility. Resources, resource groups, and subscriptions can all be members of a service group. Additionally, all of these can be members of more than one service group. So you can have one view of your services, one view by division, one view by cost, whatever is needed for you to be able to get that data aggregation. And as you mentioned, once you have your group and your members comes the fun stuff, being able to see the information that's within it. We're working across to give it first-class information across anything in your Azure environment. I'll show a quick demo of how you can get health of your application if you model your applications. In service groups, we're also working on things like cost, security, and others. Okay, as promised, service groups and all the other groups that exist today. This is a quick chart to kind of highlight the 5 things that we want to keep in mind when we're trying to make a decision as to what group fits best for my scenario. Service groups, as you can see here, is meant to be that least privileged group, a group that others can use to kind of understand the information that lays on it and gives them that flexible membership. Versus other groups like management groups and subscriptions, we still expect to stay high privilege and varies, and that's why those are kind of lay within the policy and RBAC inheritance space. I'm going to switch into a quick demo of how would I model my application using service groups. So here, I work for the Contoso Insurance Company, and I have a claims application where customers can come in and file claims. This is an important production application that I want modeled. I have some shared services across for all the insurance applications. I have my actual application of information that I managed, and I also have some common management services. Those translate loosely into this for my environment. As you can see, they're spread across management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups, make it very, very hard for me to understand the health and the costs and different needs of my application. But no fret, someone already got started and built the initial tree for me for my claims application. So I'm now going to go dive deep and take a look as to how that's looking. So here, I'm in the portal, looking at my claims application service group that was created. Here I can see that the service group has already parents, and it's succeeded. And I'm going to look at the members to validate what was added. I see it has a list of quite a bit of different resources, but I'm not seeing any of my backend resources. So let me create a child service group to this claims application. To create a service group, all you need is a service group name and a parent. Anyone within the tenant that has valid permissions will be able to create that service group. So I go and create my service group. Once I create my service group, the next most important thing is to add members to the service group. So I can see the service group is created and go to click members. The ability to add members really relies on the existing permissions that you have from the current tree. Here you can see that I'm adding a resource group that I already have access to. By adding the resource group or subscription or other resource containers as members to your service groups, the resources within those groups are indirect resources of the service group, so they are encompassed. I can also use Portal's flexibility of filtering to be able to filter on existing data. So let's say I already know that I have a cost code that filters down my back-end application resources. So I'm going to look for that cost, add it in, and then I can do a point-in-time add all to my service group. Great. So now I have my service group, and I have the members that I need. Now let's get into the fun stuff. So let's say I'm trying to figure out, okay, my application's looking a little bit weird. How can I get more information on this? Well, using the recently launched Azure Monitor Health model, I'm able to link that health model to my service group. If I go over to the entities, I'm able to see each individual resource that is a member of that health model and the health of each of those. I can also see the aggregated health for my application. Additionally, with Azure Monitor's health model, I'm able to see a timeline of this. So I can see that earlier in the day, there was some resources that were acting not quite right, and my application was degraded. So that's the beginning for service groups and being able to use health model. We also have future integrations, such as more with Azure Monitor and being able to see AI-generated issues and fired alerts. And we're also working to have additional scenarios in the future. So look out for those. If you're interested in being part of the preview for service groups, it is a public preview for everyone with tenant-level onboarding. I'll leave this QR code on the screen for a little bit for everyone to sign up and share your tenant ID for that. But we're really excited for it and hope you guys are as well. With that, I think we have a healthy amount of time for questions. So I'll kick those off. I'll leave this on the screen for a little and then flip on to the other one. Any questions? There is a mic in the back right over there. Anything governance, we're happy to talk.
So you mentioned policy as code, which is, there are some things out there that are fantastic if you've used enterprise policy as code.
Yep.
But one thing I've noticed from just discussions while I've been at Build this week is that a lot of people are just completely unaware of policy. Like they were asking, well, how can I do this? And I need an AI agent to do that. And I'm like, well, it exists. So is there a way that we can sort of get policy pushed more to the forefront of people's minds, and sort of as they're coming on to the platform, that's so they're at least aware of it. Because as we see vibe coding and all of these other security things around that, it's going to become an issue pretty quick. So I guess that's kind of my question.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and it does echo some of the sentiments from the conversations, we've been having at booths as well. So you called out a really great, source of, material to learn more about policy as code. A few other places that we've tried to, sort of insert the policy message and value proposition is within the cloud adoption framework, as well as Azure landing zones, for some of those net new scenarios. But we are trying to figure out what the best places are to have that message be spread even wider, through both internal blogs as well as engagement, with the MVP community. So, I'd be curious if there are places that you're looking where, you feel like, oh, we should really be plugging the policy message even further here, and then we would, love to take that forward too. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, but echo the sentiments. Awesome. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. You mentioned the policy enforcement resource that's coming soon.
Yes.
Will that require modifying an existing policy, or is that something which we just sort of toggle on and off? So right now, when we provision new subscriptions, we have to create an exemption because the things we create don't align with the policy that's been defined at the tenant level, and it's kind of clunky. So I'm interested in the idea that if they don't need to buy into that policy until a later date, I can see it solving a problem. I was wondering how we set that up. Can the policy just be said that this is going to be an optional policy, or does the policy itself need to change?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so today, in order to have a policy be in enrollment mode, that's a property on the assignment that unfortunately cannot be gradually redeployed through a selector. So there would need to be a net new assignment in order to have a policy deployed in enrollment mode. What I could see maybe being a solution in that case is for net new subscriptions, having a staging management group where the policies are deployed in enrollment mode. So then you can have teams, ultimately opt in or enroll, and then at that point, moving that subscription into the scope of the central enforcement.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, most of us will be hanging around for the next 10, 15 minutes. If you want to have a longer conversation about your environment or anything we spoke about here today. But again, really appreciate folks coming out at 8:30 on the last day of build. So yeah, looking forward to staying connected and hopefully, continuing to engage at events like these with you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.